In today's video, we're taking a look at a custom computer that I grabbed online for just £7.50, which turned out to be both a bit of a bargain and a bit of an adventure with some interesting issues. Now, this right here is my new custom computer that I grabbed off eBay for £7.50, which was due to a couple of things. Namely, it was listed as computer modem for parts only, which is always a recipe for your PC system going completely under the radar on eBay, and was also originally up for $6.99, but I was bidding against Cobbs from our own Discord unknowingly, so ended up paying a whopping 51p more for this system than we could have ended up paying. Still, it's only 51p, but it would have been nice to get it for under £7. All that was left to do now was find out just what kind of PC did we get, and is what we actually ordered in the box. Well, outside the excruciatingly bad packaging, mostly consisting of anything that remotely resembled cardboard or foam stuffed into a box, that was all there really was to it. And the PC did look like it had been tossed around a lot without much to hold it in place. But it was cheap and relatively modern, and supposedly well, I mean, we knew nothing about it really. The description was limited to just saying no hard drive and parts only. So for what we all know, this thing doesn't actually work. But it looked relatively okay, even if it was just a bit beaten up. We are using the CRT just to see if we get a display, and some of you may be wondering why. Is there a mystical reason that we're using this? And the real answer is, I've lost all my VGA cables mysteriously, and other than the classic broken US Smart monitor that really is on its last legs, this is about all I have on hand with the VGA input. But after a bit of setting up with all the random cables and accessories we might need, it turned out I had been a little bit optimistic giving it a keyboard and mouse this early on, because when we pushed the power button, absolutely nothing happened. There wasn't a single sign of life. So it was time to start troubleshooting and find out, had we just bought a complete dud of a computer? Turns out what had happened was all the cables inside had pretty much become dislodged and were just hanging out of their sockets, which explained the slight electrical hum that was coming from the lower motherboard area when you plugged it in. I don't know how much shielding that CIT power supplies have, but every single power supply I've owned by CIT has gone bang at some point or another once they usually have to power something akin to a HT7870, which is well within the 500 watt limit that these things claim to have. I'll give you a real clue, they can power about 250 watts before things go bad. And eventually, after taking out everything and reconnecting it, it was all clipped in place and we had our first signs of life. It turned on, made a small beep, and then carried on posting. So it seems we have a rather decent gigabyte motherboard based on socket 1155. But to do a bit of deeper digging to see if this thing really was 4 parts, I threw in an SSD with a basic Windows 10 install, and almost immediately the thing started to boot up to the desktop in what seemed like record time, meaning we can find out a little bit more about what is actually inside this PC without having to do a full teardown just yet, which is always a bit nice. And what we have managed to score seems to be from the depths of eBay and for no money, and we've got 4GB of DDR3 based RAM clocking in at 1333 MHz, along with a Pentium dual-core G2030, which isn't exciting but does mean we have access to a modern socket, which was the start of the real modern Intel processors, sort of. I mean, there's still a lot of similarities with Sandybridge going on today, which have gotten particularly cheap at this point, and that'll be a point you want to stick around for later on in the video as there are some upgrades. And despite it saying DirectX 12 there, we don't have that. We have the iGPU that comes with this here Pentium, which is the despised Intel HD 3000 chip, a chip that had a questionable reputation at best. We did also get a wireless adapter included, so at least that part of the PC calling itself a modem sort of rings true with reality, even if it is just loosely. And all we had to do there was bolt on some antenna so that it could actually do something, but that part all worked, and it worked fine even on the Windows 10 desktop without any drivers. But back to the reality of this PC, and it was speedy on the desktop. But that was quickly about it. I did install the latest modded Intel HD drivers just to spare your eyes the flickering. That was the 67.5Hz output that this PC defaults to. It didn't offer anything other than this, but I suppose that's just Intel HD for you. But as it stood, the results from the PC were at best decent for an office computer, and a whole world of underwhelming when it came to anything remotely intensive. In the basic of benchmarks, it could handle old games and benchmarks, with it running sort of like a slideshow in 3D Mark, albeit with weirdly excellent frame times, which was impressive. Games like Half-Life 2 did run alright in their original form, as in the original release from all the way back in 2004, which I keep on hand to benchmark PCs from about 2004, but still, it ran here. Just not so much stuff that comes from the Intel Core era actually ran okay. Anything remotely modern could lock up the system, which isn't any real surprise, but really they should load, so something else is going on here, something that maybe we need to fix. But for those of you wanting a real taste of the Intel HD nostalgia, setting up Skyrim to run at the absolutely lowest of settings and resolutions made it surprisingly playable. I don't think I've seen a system get detected for low settings in Skyrim for a long time, so that was actually somewhat nice to see in a weird odd way, and it was about as far as we could go on the stock system. But we have an 1155 base that cost us next to nothing, bringing us to what will become the main part of this here video. Right, so you join me back outside on what is a rather miserable day, to be honest. It's a bit windy, it's a bit nasty, but we do have the £7.50 computer, and we do have some cheap upgrades in mind. Namely, the graphics card is one thing that's going to need changing, because Intel HD doesn't cut it, and a new processor might be rather nice. Unfortunately, we've got one big issue. See, I grabbed a GTX 780, thinking that maybe we could use that as it was just £12, but nope. See, CIT power supplies might say 500 watts, what it can probably do is just past 250. So we're limited to lower power parts. So what we're going to be using is a Core i5-2400S that I've grabbed for 10p, and we're going to be using an R7-450 that I picked up for £5. I've also grabbed a little bit of RAM, meaning that we spent, I don't know, just about £6 on upgrades to give this thing, you know, maybe a bit of chance of working quite well. So why don't we go ahead, add those upgrades, and get it all a little bit nicer. With all of those cheap upgrades installed, it was time to get on with the real part of this experience, which consisted of going to turn it on, and then the PC promptly getting angry and doing a whole load of beeping. After ages troubleshooting the PC, I narrowed it down to our cheap 10p Core i5, of which we were sent the wrong version. I ordered an i5-2400S because it uses less power, and with that questionable power supply that's not necessarily a bad thing, and we were sent an i5-2400. But the thing is, this i5 tested fine in another system, and this one would boot back up when I put the Pentium back in it, so all signs pointed to our processor, or something related to it. And that was when I noticed there were bent pins in the socket, and it was probably providing just enough power and data to give the Pentium a chance of working, but the Core i5, well, it had no hope, and it probably answered a couple of questions we had earlier. One of the reasons why it was also probably listed for parts is probably because there were some odd stability issues in applications like GTA 5 and anything that would actually spike the processor up to 100% that could near enough crash out or stall the system. Still, after hours and hours of clearing out the socket with a pin and carefully bending them back into shape, at least something that resembled the socket it was meant to, everything seemed to work out just fine. And if you're wondering why the lighting's changed, and suddenly so did my clothes, well, that's because it was such an ongoing issue that it lasted a couple of days, as every time we got some degree of stability, I'd go back to it in a few hours, and it would just stop working and start beeping again, and I'd have to go back and adjust the pins until eventually we had a PC that didn't matter how long I left it for, I could push the on button and we could use it. I've also now switched to using the laptop screen as a display because we can actually have a chance of using 1080p rather than 800 by 600. So maybe we're in with a chance of some high definition stuff. Who knows? Other than that, all we had to do was sort out some drivers, of which, for those that have seen the video on the R7 450, AMD doesn't actually even list this card on their website. They did make it, it's a bit strange, I recommend watching the full video on it, but you can just download the last GCN1 drivers from any card of that architecture, and it seems to work just fine. So to recap, what we've got now is an i5-2400 mistakenly sent to us rather than its lower power variant. They both cost 10p, so it's not exactly surprising that's happened. We also have a £5 AMD R7 450 paired with now 8GB of rather slow DDR3, because lower clock DDR3, it's worthless. You can pick this stuff up for literally pennies on CEX or eBay or even AliExpress. And for a lot of these early ring bus based processors, there isn't a good degree of performance hit for using the slower variants. And it's all powered by a rather questionable power supply. So this totaled in cost just under £15, which is a prime example of why to pick up a PC like this. You can start off with something that's a bit abysmal, and you end up with something that's a little bit of a bargain. But just how well do these upgrades translate to decent performance in the benchmarks? Starting things off with Counter-Strike 2, and with competitive settings, which mostly means low everything and high shadows, gave us relatively good performance, with 71 FPS on average. It didn't matter what we put shadows on, keep in mind, and the frame times did seem slightly smoother when we turned them up. Generally, the game took a few minutes to stabilise though, as when using the built-in benchmark straight up after starting the game, performance was plagued with stuttering and other issues, which quickly went away on the second run and during actual gameplay. So something a bit strange going on there, but that's probably down to the fact that Counter-Strike 2 is based on Source 2, and that can have issues on older PCs with older drivers, but still, it ran fine. And I think, honestly, the game feeling sluggish and heavy is just because that's the way CS2 is now. And performance here was decent, and I didn't have too many issues playing the game, other than being absolutely downright terrible at it. Now, this was a rather interesting one, with Red Dead Redemption 2 running in 720p with lower settings. The game was relatively stable, even though we only had 8GB of RAM. Something that most people would lead you to believe would make the game completely unplayable. The game could often hover around the mid-20s when there was intensive scenery going on, but there weren't all too many issues, and that is at this point the graphics card being the limit. And there was an issue with the graphics options having to be set via the config file, which is an issue I've documented on the R7 450, as despite its brilliant form factor, pricing and performance, the final drivers perform brilliantly, but some games struggle to understand what card it's dealing with. The game knows there's an R7 450 in the system, but won't let us set settings, because it can't detect that it's got 4GB of VRAM. Still, the performance seemed relatively stable, and I'd have no issues calling this more than playable, especially on such a cheap system. BeamNG was off to a brilliant start in 720p with the medium preset selected. Throughout the usual throwing a truck down a hill benchmark, we saw the game run at a fairly solid 47 FPS on average, sometimes even higher than this when the physics side had calmed down a little bit. Even the frame times were very solid, with the game never hitching or buffering, which was nice to see. However, when moving on to more complex maps, we could get a warning about hitting the RAM limit, which once dismissed didn't seem like too much of a bother, but frame times found themselves being closer to around 30 FPS rather than the 40 to 60 FPS we were seeing beforehand. Still, it was nice that we managed to achieve playable frame rates without having to tweak any settings lower when things get intensive, so BeamNG completely playable. Next up was GTA 5, which ran at around 59 FPS on average, but could drop down to the mid-40s during heavy action. This was with the high settings mostly used, all the way up in a 1080p resolution. And it was at this point I should note that the CPU and GPU utilization overlays are a bit bugged, as despite us seeing 100% utilization, it didn't seem to register in the overlay. This is an issue that I found out why just later on in the video. Generally though, throughout most of the single player game, we would see anywhere from 40 to 60 FPS, and sometimes over this when not much was going on. Lower settings wouldn't do much to help the frame rate, so we were best off just enjoying the things as they were, with some rather nice high settings and resolution. However, in the world of online, we are now doing two sets of tests, one for over 16 players where the netcode goes a bit insane, and one where we are under 16 players. And things seem to work. And starting off with the more intense of the two showed almost half the frame rate of the single player game, with the frame rate feeling a little bit more all over the place, despite what the average might lead you to believe. It wasn't unplayable, but it does certainly show that some of those more intensive lobbies can really halve the performance, as that is literally what we're seeing here, is half the performance by going over 16 players in online mode. When dropping under the 16 player mark though, our frame rate was back up to where it was in single player. It was still slightly worse, but I'm putting this down to battle line now being implemented, which on an older 4-core processor like the i5, we are going to be seeing a bit of a performance hit, especially when this game does actually use all 4 of our cores to 100% utilization. Still, it was completely playable with 40 to 60 FPS on average, usually sticking to the lower end of the 50s though. Such a huge performance disparity between this and the larger lobby, where the moment that the lobby falls under 16 players, you literally double your performance. And this is a documented problem, but does show that you're best off sticking to smaller lobbies in GTA Online. With Bannerlord, we were still sticking to the 1080p resolution with a mixture of low and medium settings. Mainly medium settings here. The main thing the system couldn't handle all too well was the shadows, which worked fine in the early game, but in our larger benchmark, the processor just couldn't manage it, so we opted for the lower settings. Still, even with as much as we could handle turned up to medium, we were able to see 38 FPS in the big old battle benchmark, and performance could be closer to 60 FPS during a lot of the early to mid game, with only these intense situations bringing you down to this mark. And we had all of this while running in a nice 1080p resolution, which I wasn't expecting to be able to manage here, even with the R7 450. For brand new titles like the upcoming Tavern Keeper, given it has a heavy reliance on SSAO and anti-aliasing, which means you can't turn them off by default, we did have to run the game with everything else set to low in a 720p resolution, but we could still manage playable frame rates. I don't know if there are system requirements out there for this yet, but I'd say this gives you a good idea of what you'll need to be able to run the game in at least high definition with a playable frame rate. It did take a while to stabilize, keep in mind, but was completely fine, and it just turns out this is rather more intensive than it looks, given the limited set of graphics options. But if the developers were looking for minimum requirements, I'd say a system like this is just about it. Minecraft ran with every setting I could find in the Optifine menu set to fancy in a 1080p resolution with a relatively high chunk distance. We saw well over 100 FPS a lot of the time, and there wasn't really much you could do to bring this down. Even with fire and effects going on, there wasn't all too much that could actually affect the system, which was impressive to see, and there is such little to comment on here when performance is this good. All I can really say is you could get away with a nice texture pack or maybe some decent shaders if you really wanted to, as you've got a ton of performance overhead going on here. Finally, we had Skyrim, which was the original port running in 1080p with the ultra setting selected, and it was perfect even with the general chaos of Skyrim going on. I did turn down the anti-aliasing a little bit as it defaults to an incredibly high 8 times from the preset, but other than that, it looked and ran perfectly. With lower settings, the Anniversary Edition would also run fine, and I'd imagine other titles up to Fallout 4 would also run perfectly fine as well, so there's no issues there. It was just nice to see Skyrim in its original release running pretty much maxed out at a near enough 60 FPS, unless things got intense. But can it run Crysis? Well, surprisingly, yes it can, and very well too, with a mixture of medium and high settings in 1080p, and we saw around 70 FPS, which when you consider the combination of parts here, and the fact that they are worth more or less next to nothing, anyone can get a hold of these parts very easily. This is decent. There could be drops in frame rate when things got heavy, but that's because the game only uses 2 cores, and ours aren't clocked that high. So Crysis, completely playable with higher settings in a full HD resolution on a PC that you could build for next to nothing. Talking about those cores not being clocked high, I did find the issue with the performance overlay, and for some unknown reason, and I'm putting it down to the fact this PC is strange and has bent pins, every program on the PC that reported the i5 detected it as running at 5 GHz. It wasn't, but no matter what you did in the BIOS, it would always detect it as running at those clocks. Strange, but not an issue. The first time I actually noticed this was running 3D Mark, as at the end it gave us the processor readout saying we had a top clock speed of 5,900 MHz, which is just about double what we should have. It never ran at this, mind, and also showed that we had relatively balanced performance, and apparently our processor could have managed more, which isn't something I was expecting from Sandybridge, given that this combination, we have a processor from 2011, and a graphics card that is more or less based on an architecture from 2012 despite being relatively new, and everything out there today is still playable within reason. Even games like Red Dead Redemption 2 run in 720p. There's no fancy tricks, it's just lower settings in 720p, and it was still playable. Now this might be a controversial opinion, but it really shouldn't be. For basic day-to-day usage, there is nothing to say. I doubt anyone using an older, not even high-end Sandybridge i5 could tell a difference between this and a modern processor, simply because not enough has changed. Yes, if you really piled it on, then there would be some slowdown because you've only got 4 cores, so if you're opening a heavy game, a modern heavy game, you would notice slowdown, but for those just doing work day to day, there is no reason you can't be using an i5-2400, which is a 10p processor now. Really, we should be taking a look at that by itself, because it's almost a complete standout just by itself, the fact that this processor is this good and this cheap. And with a more powerful graphics card, I do wonder what it could achieve. And maybe for another video we'll have to find out. But for the vast majority of people, Sandybridge is still fine. And it's very cheap, very affordable, and these systems, they cost nothing. Finally, I suppose one advantage of having this R7 card is that for once the AMD VCE actually works, which is the video encoding engine. So you can actually do some game recording, streaming, or whatever it is you want it to do, and no, it can't compete with modern alternatives like NVENC or QuickSync, but it's good enough to turn anything into a PC that can both record and stream with little in the way of a performance hit. Even when running games that are CPU intensive, there is nothing in the way of slowdown, as all that workload is being done by the graphics card. And the actual output doesn't look too bad either. I know if you're on a poor internet connection and having to stream, there would probably be some noticeable artifacting, but even then, if you just wanted to use your PC for recording or streaming, you can now do that on a system that you can throw together for £15, which is very impressive. So there we have it. I don't know what this video is more about at this point. We've had a bit of everything from troubleshooting a really cheap PC under the wrong name, some really basic Intel HD benchmarks, and ultimately turned this thing into a really good value budget build that is up there in performance with both the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, and all for around £15. And this isn't hard to do. These processors are worthless, an 1155 PC can cost you next to nothing like we've seen here. Really, if we had a better power supply, you could probably try and compete with the PlayStation 5 and whatever the Xbox equivalent is, purely because those old Sandy i5s are doing fine, and the i7s, well, they don't cost much more, and until we see the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 dropped in their base, form, we're going to carry on being that way. There is nothing stressing these processors enough to make them unusable. All you need is a decent graphics card, maybe one better than the R7 450. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and good night.